Hi, I'm Michael Poff with the Carter-Jenkins Center. In part one of this presentation, we saw how the continuing debate within psychoanalysis and anthropology over the universal Oedipus complex is only part of the greater controversy and much more contentious debate over Freud's evolutionary claim that human civilization itself arose as a collective means of mastering the Oedipus complex, that all of culture, art, and civilization converge in the Oedipus complex, as Freud put it. We saw how the most important anthropological critique of the 20th century was Malinowski's Sex and Repression in Savage Society from 1927. And we saw how Malinowski's argument continues to be repeated from within psychoanalysis to this very day, in spite of the fact that by mid-century already it had begun to fall apart from within anthropology due to long overdue criticism and revisitation. In the present part two, we'll see how new iterations within psychoanalysis of Malinowski's old argument continue to misrepresent Oedipal theory and to perpetuate what I've referred to as the fallacy of pathological patriarchy as the cause of the Oedipus complex. I hope to show that this fallacy confuses the difference between what causes the Oedipus complex and what complicates its resolution in Freudian theory. A particularly interesting example of this can be seen in Malinowski's curious prediction that the Oedipus complex would eventually disappear, and this was 90 years ago, would eventually disappear in Western societies as the Western father would inevitably become more and more weak and henpecked, as he put it. I hope that this helps to sort out the confusion that's occurred within the past century and continues to show up in the contemporary literature over and over again. Anyone interested in the text of this presentation, the full text, can follow the link on the Carter-Jenkins Center's website to the issue number 2 of the Journal of Controversial Discussions from 2020. And as always, thank you for your interest and thank you for visiting the Carter-Jenkins Center's website. The explanatory power of Freud's actual theory becomes even clearer when we expand our considerations beyond individual ontogeny to the larger cultural and evolutionary questions that Freud took up in Totem and Taboo. To do so is to bring the concept of the component drives into the service of our understanding of how individual psychology and psychopathology manifests in specifically collective forms. After all, Totem and Taboo was Freud's first attempt to explain the causal relations between these two levels. Let's consider the climactic deed in Totem and Taboo, the murder and cannibalism of the primal father by the younger males in their sexual competition for possession of the females. Freud's synthesis includes a psychodynamic explanation for how collective actions that would appear to be solely the expression of drive activity in its most regressed or primitive state, that is to say oral and anal sadistic cannibalism, can be more comprehensively understood in terms of these pre-Oedipal components being mobilized in the service of infantile genital or phallic Oedipal aims, and eventually in the service of mature reproductive genital primacy. In the initial stages of this process, associated with evolutionary advances such as use of weapons, the primal father is killed and ingested in the service of possessing his phallic power over the horde and his genitally procreative monopoly over the females. This represents an oral incorporative form of identification brought into the service of phallic Oedipal aims at the shared level of the group. This deed, both real and imagined, Freud's thesis includes both actually, is quintessentially Oedipal, precisely to the extent that it stands without resolution and is driven by fantasies of omnipotence and idealized sexual satisfaction. Such hopes remain as futile as the Oedipal child's omnipotent wish to replace the rival parent. No sooner is the primal deed accomplished than its victor becomes the next victim. In Freud's account, the collective solution to this Oedipal dilemma in the course of cultural evolution was a set of compromise formations. These took the form of the elaborate system of totemic rituals and taboos regulating aggression, sex, and reproductive exogamy, characteristic of so-called primitive society. Freud proposed that the corollary in individual psychosexual development of this phylogenetic achievement is evident in the dissolution of the Oedipus complex, the relinquishing of Oedipal objects by means of an introjection into one's own ego of the Oedipal rival's values, those that now represent the exigencies of communal reality and pair bonding. This usually takes place around the age of 5 to 6 years old. This identification further consolidates conscience formation, and it exemplifies a triumph of the reality principle. Conversely, just as with the castration by and murder of the primal father, no sooner are traumatic Oedipal defeats or victories experienced by the child, which can occur for many reasons, for example, physical and sexual abuse, overstimulation, separation, divorce, death of a parent, etc., then difficulties arise for the child's ability to resolve the Oedipal conflicts and move beyond them. Malinowski's weak and henpecked father. The analogous relationship between Oedipal defeats or victories in childhood on the one hand and the primal events, repeated over millennia on the other hand, allows us to underscore the evolutionary biological basis of Oedipal theory. To this end, let's return to Malinowski's critique. In Sex and Repression in Savage Society, what Malinowski claimed to have discovered was a different type of a more generally defined nuclear complex, the nature of which had to be determined for each particular society. Quote, "I have established a deep correlation between the type of society and the nuclear complex found there." End quote. It could be an Oedipus complex, a matrilineal complex, and at least theoretically any number of other possible types of nuclear complex. In a remarkable passage, Malinowski even appears to have engaged in something of a symbolic patricide of his own when he prophesied the end of the British and American patriarchy, and along with it the extinction of an already endangered Oedipus complex. Quote, "Psychoanalysis cannot hope, I think, to preserve its Oedipus complex for future generations, who will only know a weak and henpecked father. For him the children will feel indulgent pity rather than hatred and fear." End quote. It's tempting to imagine something of Malinowski's own Oedipal ambivalence in this fantastic conjecture of his, but more relevantly, it underscores the fact that he never considered the matrilineal complex to be simply another version of the Oedipus complex based on different customs. What becomes clear when we consider Malinowski's abysmal forecast for the Western father is that he had never viewed the Trobriand matrilineal complex as a mere subtype within Oedipal theory, some kind of different Oedipus complex. Malinowski's actual view is important to understand because a misrepresentation of his thesis, precisely to this effect, arose in anthropology and psychoanalysis, and I'll argue continues to be a source of confusion over what constitutes an actual Oedipal conflict. A major consequence of this confusion is that it obscures the critical difference in Freudian theory between what causes the Oedipus complex on the one hand and what complicates its resolution on the other hand. For this reason, a brief detour to explain this confusion over Malinowski's thesis will be helpful before we address the greater phylogenetic significance of what actually causes the Oedipus complex. Around the time of the closely coinciding deaths of Freud, Malinowski, and Boas, Freud in 1939 and both the latter in 1942, Boas, by the way, is considered the father of modern American cultural anthropology. This idea that Malinowski had argued for a type of Oedipus complex became more common among leading figures in the disciplines. Ironically, Malinowski's own critique of the universal Oedipus complex came eventually to be misrepresented by anthropologists and psychoanalysts alike, as if it had posited a matrilineal form of the Freudian Oedipus complex. An illustration of the cross-disciplinary and authoritative reach of this revision in the fate of Malinowski's very non-Oedipal matrilineal complex can be seen in Fenichel's influential psychoanalytic theory of the Neuroses from 1945, where he claimed that Malinowski had argued, quote, that societies with family configurations different from our own actually have different Oedipus complexes, end quote. Fenichel was describing here what he claimed to be Malinowski's own conclusion. This was remarkable given the fact that, as far as Malinowski was concerned, the different Oedipus complexes that Fenichel was referring to bore little resemblance to Freud's Oedipal theory. From anthropology, Kroeber had largely confused matters 6 years earlier in a revisitation of his critique from 1920 of Totem and Taboo, which had been excoriating in nature. Published 2 months after Freud's death, Kroeber's reappraisal began with no great reconciliation. Quote, I see no reason to waver over my critical analysis of Freud's book. There is no indication that the consensus of anthropologists during these 20 years has moved even an inch nearer acceptance of Freud's central thesis, end quote. Kroeber went on to rebuke the Freudians for their all-or-nothing attitude of, quote, partaking of the nature of a religion, a system of mysticism, and possessing the qualities of a delusional system, end quote. All this for insisting that concepts like the superego and the Oedipus complex were defined systematically and would not retain their coherence if decoupled and not taken together. Then, in a strange sleight of hand, Kroeber asserted that Malinowski had, quote, showed that the mechanism of the Oedipus complex remained operative even in a changed family situation, end quote. He went on to suggest that Malinowski had argued for Freud's theory by demonstrating what Kroeber considered to be the, quote, kernel of the Oedipus situation, end quote, which consisted of, quote, the incest drive and incest repression, filial ambivalence, and the like, end quote. Actually, it's possible that if Malinowski's own interpretation of his data had found at least these to be true for the Trobrian child between 3 to 5 years of age, then at least some of the controversy could have been avoided. But as we'll see, wish as Kroeber might, Malinowski had not interpreted his own data in this manner. Instead, he convinced 2 generations of anthropologists and many neo-Freudian psychoanalysts that Trobrian boys at this age had no triangular filial ambivalence and no incest drive toward the mother whatsoever, least of all any that could cause destructive fantasies of eliminating the father, unconscious or otherwise. A truly matrilineal form of the Oedipus complex would have been in complete agreement with Freud and is what Oedipal theory would predict. But this was not Malinowski's thesis. In fact, given the sociopolitical and economic nature of his argument, and I would argue ideology, he could not have been much clearer. Quote, the complex exclusively known to the Freudian school and assumed by them to be universal, I mean the Oedipus complex, corresponds essentially to our patrilineal Aryan family with its developed patria potestas, buttressed by Roman law and Christian morals, and accentuated by the modern economic conditions of the well-to-do bourgeoisie. Yet this complex is assumed to exist in every savage or barbarous society. This certainly cannot be correct, and a detailed discussion of the first problem will show us how far this assumption is untrue, end quote. There would have been no debate with Freud, by proxy with Jones, Roheim, and others, if Malinowski's thesis had determined simply that the Oedipus complex varies in form according to different social structures. Indeed, this was Jones's position in his defense of Freud. Not surprisingly, Jones was just as clear about Malinowski's position as Malinowski was. Malinowski attempts to modify Freud's theory of the nuclear complex. As is well known, the latter regards the relationship between father, mother, and son as the prototype from which other more complicated relationships are devised. Malinowski, on the other hand, or on the contrary, puts forward the idea that the nuclear family complex varies according to the particular family structure existing in any community, end quote. Jones's position remained true to Freud's designation of the Oedipus complex as the universal nuclear complex. Jones correctly showed that Freud's Oedipal theory predicted that the Oedipal dynamics stemming from the nuclear triangle could be displaced onto any variety of objects according to the given social structures. Jones argued that, quote, the matrilineal system with its avunculate complex arose as a mode of defense against the primordial Oedipus tendencies. The forbidden and unconsciously loved sister is only a substitute for the mother, as the uncle plainly is for the father, end quote. It wasn't just Jones who clarified the terms of the debate. Roheim also took the same theoretical position against Malinowski's matrilineal complex. In his brilliant The Rise of Anthropological Theory from 1968, Marvin Harris would point out, quote, contrary to popular impression, in the argument between Roheim and Malinowski over the effect of the Trobriand matrilineal organization on the Oedipal situation, it is Roheim who holds the trump card. By Malinowski's own admission, the Trobriand child is brought up largely under the influence of the usual nuclear pairs. Mother's brother enters the picture only when the child is 7 or 8 years old, an age by which the Oedipal constellation is firmly entrenched, end quote. Once again, there is no confusion about the actual terms of the debate. The Oedipus complex, as Freud had defined it, was the universal nuclear complex, yes or no. It should be clear from the foregoing discussion that Malinowski's argument was never that the nuclear Oedipus complex could manifest in different forms according to different customs. Not once in 300 pages of Sex and Repression in Savage Society did he refer to anything slightly resembling the reinterpretation that others, like Fenichel and Kroeber, applied to his thesis, such as different Oedipus complexes or matrilineal form of the Oedipus complex. Instead, Malinowski refers to, quote, the matrilineal complex so entirely different in its genesis and its character from the Oedipus complex, end quote. He exhorts psychoanalysts, quote, not to assume the universal existence of the Oedipus complex, end quote. He claims that with the assumption that the, quote, Oedipus complex exists in all types of society, certain errors have crept into anthropological work of psychoanalysts, end quote. The increasing use of Oedipal terminology to describe Malinowski's own thesis and critique of Freudian theory was an ironic development, to say the least. The so-called different Oedipus complex that Fenichel and others had in mind, meaning the matrilineal complex of Malinowski, represented a radical undoing of Freudian Oedipal theory. Not only was it supposed to have proven that the Oedipus complex was not universal, in the cross-cultural sense, but it had also redefined it as a pathological symptom of patriarchy. According to Malinowski, the Oedipus complex was not a normal developmental conflict in need of resolution, but an institutionalized illness in need of a cure. Yet this same thesis, accepted as valid, was now being referred to as though it had confirmed a universal Oedipal structure of which it was merely a type. Subsequent generations of preeminent anthropologists, such as University of Chicago's Milton Singer, would refer without questioning the validity of it to this revisionist idea that Malinowski had argued for a, quote, matrilineal form of the Oedipus complex among the Trobriand islanders, end quote. Arguably, the condensation and decoupling of core psychoanalytic concepts taking place in the course of the debates represented nothing more than a critique from anthropology and from within psychoanalysis of Oedipal theory, a rhetorical means of refuting Freud's claims with faint praise and loose appropriations. On the other hand, given the indications of a traumatic element operating in the confrontation, the fact that this rhetorical shift was concurrent with the deaths of Freud, Boas, and Malinowski, just as their grieving followers had become wartime allies, also suggested that a wish for some mediating function in the bitter controversy may have begun to surface. In this case, the construct of a matrilineal Oedipus complex may also have functioned in a manner similar to that of the totemic object, as Freud had conceived of this, as a compromise formation, forged out of necessity on behalf of an otherwise warring band of siblings in a time of ambivalent mourning and existential danger. The fact that during this same catastrophic period of wartime, the controversial discussions between embattled followers of Anna Freud and Melanie Klein in London were taking place and would lead to a gentleman's agreement at the war's end is certainly worth examining in this same light. Malinowski himself may have originally contributed to the confusion when he claimed that his thesis had confirmed, quote, the main tenet of Freudian psychology, end quote. But this had nothing to do with the Oedipus complex, per se. He simply meant there that he had, quote, established a deep correlation between the type of society and the nuclear complex found there. Given the nature of Malinowski's critique, this certainly did Freud no favors. Once again, from the latter's point of view, it amounted to a rhetorical means of undoing Oedipal theory with faint praise. Aside from the fact that Freud never suggested such a watered-down definition of his main psychological tenet, the essential point remained that the Oedipus complex was supposed to be universal, and Malinowski had found no such complex in the Trobriand Islands. On the central question of the universality of the Freudian Oedipus complex, Malinowski's position could not have been clearer. The Trobriand matrilineal complex was not a different type of Oedipus complex. It was a different type of nuclear complex. Therefore, the Oedipus complex was not universal. His entire argument relied explicitly on the assertion that the nuclear complex of Trobriand society was, quote, so entirely different in its genesis and its character from the Oedipus complex, end quote. Indeed, Malinowski's prediction of an end to the Oedipus complex and Western patriarchy itself with the arrival of a, quote, weak and henpecked father, end quote, would have made no sense otherwise. With these considerations in mind, let's return now to Malinowski's prediction that the Oedipus complex would become extinct with the rise of a weak and henpecked father. As I've said, this idea obscured the distinction between what causes the Oedipus complex and what complicates its resolution. Malinowski's prediction relied on the premise that the father's power, or more accurately the pathological abuse of it, causes the Oedipus complex. It assumed that in the absence of oppressive patriarchal authority, the son's hostile emotions toward the father associated with sexual rivalry for the mother's love would not arise. This premise was a reflection of Malinowski's idiosyncratic rendering of Freudian theory, and upon closer scrutiny, the flaw in the logic of it becomes easy to recognize. It was equivalent to saying that someone competing for sexual love could feel no hostility toward a rival, so long as that rival posed no actual danger or actual realistic physical threat. This allowed for no role on the part of the child's projections onto the father based on infantile fantasies. It also allowed for no role whatsoever for narcissistic envy or jealous rage directed toward objects perceived merely as competitors for love and attachment. The only relevant etiological factor in Malinowski's formula for the Oedipus complex was oppressive paternal aggression. This was the same old problem that Freud had identified in his critique of the Adlerian view of life, quote unquote, namely that it was a theory, quote, founded exclusively on the aggressive instinct, according to Freud. As Freud eloquently put it, quote, there is no room in it for love, end quote. Accordingly, Malinowski's critique relied on portrayals of the Western-type father and the Trobriand father that from a contemporary perspective appeared transparently villainized on the one hand and romanticized on the other. Malinowski's representation of the patriarchal father was so one-dimensionally hostile and aggressive, in fact, so much like the tyrannical primal father in Totem and Taboo, that one can appreciate why Malinowski would have wished for his extinction as soon as possible. Ironically enough, the Viennese father of little Hans, Freud's exemplary case of child phobia that he used in Totem and Taboo, bore a closer resemblance to the Trobriand all-loving father depicted by Malinowski. Spiro, in 1982, documented the problem with these exaggerated representations and explained them in terms of Malinowski's effort to, quote, reinforce his polemical aim of proving that the hostility of the Western son is to be explained by the father's oppressive authority, end quote, rather than by the son's sexual rivalry for the mother's sole affection. In the concluding part of this presentation, we'll look more closely at the ideological influences in contemporary versions of Malinowski's old critique based on pathological patriarchy. Finally, we'll examine the fundamental biological and evolutionary foundations of Freud's Oedipal theory. These include the prolonged dependency of the human child and the precocious rate of the human child's drive development relative to its dependency. The normal set of conflicts that arise because of this disparity in human development is what Freud called the Oedipus complex.